Democrats don't want you to know. First up, polls are improving for President Trump in battleground states. A New York Times poll, of all places, measured Trump against Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Elizabeth Warren. And according to the poll, the president leads all Democrat candidates in North Carolina. He's also within the margin of error against Joe Biden in Florida, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, and tied with Biden in Michigan. Trump also has a small lead against Warren in most battleground states. This comes as the mainstream media has continued their all-out effort against the president, pushing bogus impeachment rumors and downplaying his economic accomplishments. So what does this latest battleground state poll mean for 2020? With me now to break this down, editorial fellow for USA Today Opinion, Hallie Victory Smith. Hallie, good to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
All right, talk to me about these battleground state numbers. If you listen to the mainstream media, they make it seem as though the president is on the verge of getting blown out of the water in battlegrounds. Even with the New York Times, though, they're not exactly unbiased. It doesn't seem to be the case.
Right. So I think it's really important to be paying attention to the state-by-state numbers. You know, a lot of people counted that Hillary Clinton was going to win because she did well in the national polling. But the problem with that is that, as she found out, you don't win an election with the popular vote. You win an election with the Electoral College. So you want to look at these state-by-state numbers. Now, if we look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, you see that Democrats really are either within striking distance of the president, or they're doing better than the president. So those are really important numbers to pay attention to. But you're right. There are some of these key battleground states where really Joe Biden is the one with the advantage, and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, you know, these more radical candidates just aren't doing so well.
Right, which is interesting because especially within media circles, they seem to be trying to push Biden under the rug and prop up these more radical candidates, but that may not be what voters want. So that's the first polling number that I think the Democrats don't really want voters to know. The second one has to do with women in the suburbs. So it is true that President Trump has lost support in the polls nationwide from suburban women. That would be college-educated white women, upper middle class in suburbia here. But according to new information, President Trump actually has the most big-dollar donations from suburban women compared to all of the other Democrat presidential candidates. He has over 10,000. I think it's 10,534. And he's received the most money from them as well, not just the highest number of donations. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells us something that we need to be we can't count Trump out of this, especially in the fundraising race. It's important to note that, yes, recent polling, again, from that same New York Times survey, has shown that President Trump isn't doing particularly well with suburban women. I don't think that the Trump campaign should be taking these numbers and saying, that's it, we don't have to do outreach to suburban women anymore, we're good to go. But I do think it means that, you know, maybe the media shouldn't be counting him out in those areas, and maybe we should be paying more attention to this.
Right, because this is a particularly interesting part of this Washington Examiner piece as well. Statistically, in 2016, during that election season, 28% of President Trump's itemized contributions were from women. Already for the 2020 election, they account for 35%. Again, I agree with your point.
Yeah.
The Trump administration should do more outreach to suburban women, should package their messaging to appeal to perhaps upper middle class moms that live in the suburbs, but it's simply not true to say that he has lost support, at least donation-wise.
Yeah, at least donation-wise. Now, it's good to be keeping that distinction between the two because, you know, sometimes you can encourage people to come out and fundraise and give money. That's not necessarily equivalent to the sort of people that you're going to bring out to the polls. So it's good to keep a distinction between those two numbers. But it's important to say that there is at least a certain subset of suburban women who are interested in President Trump's campaign and are going to support him.
Right. Enough at least to make a contribution. That's the second number. The third number I find particularly fascinating. So I think during this Democrat primary debate season, we're all very interested in who the front runner is. Who's going to be the presumptive nominee? You know, we're trying to see, is it going to be Bernie Sanders? Is it going to be Elizabeth Warren, Buttigieg, Biden? Who's it going to be? But according to some historical analysis, only three of the past 7 Democrat nominees led the primary field at this same point in the election cycle. And then 0 of those 3 who were leading at this point went on to be president. So it almost seems that it doesn't matter who's leading at this point.
So if you go back to Iowa in 1992, there was one guy, don't even remember his name because your audience probably doesn't remember his name either, who got 75% of the vote when it came to the Democratic primary. And Bill Clinton got 2% of the vote. He didn't do particularly well in the next early state either, but then, of course, he went on to get the Democratic nomination. You know, it's hard to be the front runner for a long period of time. You end up trying to keep attacks at bay. You have people behind you. You know, Elizabeth Warren is clearly trying to kind of ride out the draft of Biden and see if maybe he'll stay in long enough for her to just be within striking distance and then steal the nomination from him. But yeah, that is something important to pay attention to. Absolutely.
Right. And the other thing, this is an interesting part. So we know the mainstream media, once it's down to one candidate, once the Democrats have a nominee, the mainstream media is going to be on the side of the Democrat nominee. They're not going to attack the Democrat nominee. So whoever is the front runner now might get attacks from the mainstream media if the media has another preferred candidate. But if an underdog comes from the back, they may not have been attacked by the media now because they're not the front runner, and they won't be attacked by the media if they're the nominee because the media wants the Democrat to win the election. So something to think about. Of all the candidates, actually, Cory Booker brought this up. He said, we never had a candidate who was ahead in the polls this far out who has ever gone on to be president. Now, I don't think it's going to work from him, but what he says is true.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that there are a few candidates who potentially have an advantage, who really could make a go of it within the next few months here. I mean, so much can change between now and Iowa, and even between Iowa and the convention. It's entirely possible that we will see a contested convention for Democrats. Yeah, that's something really important that I think not a lot of people are talking about. Like you said, I don't think it'll be Cory Booker, but potentially somebody like Pete Buttigieg, maybe Amy Klobuchar. I know people will kind of laugh when I say that, but there are some people who could have some potential real appeal for Democratic voters that really aren't being talked about enough.
Right, exactly. And I think there's a reason why these numbers aren't being talked about, because they don't necessarily play well for the Democrat Party. The mainstream media won't report them to you, so we will. Hallie, thanks so much for being on the show. I appreciate it. On that note,